You put that gun back on and you come out in the street. I'm going to give you just 1 minute. And then I'm coming back in after you.
For decades, Gunsmoke fans wondered what really happened between Marshal Matt Dillon and Miss Kitty. On screen, their chemistry was undeniable, but off-screen, the truth was kept tightly under wraps. Now, decades later, James Arness has finally broken his silence, and what he revealed about Miss Kitty has left longtime fans stunned. Was it friendship, or was there a deeper connection that stayed hidden for years? This isn't just about TV nostalgia. It's about what was really going on behind the scenes of one of television's most iconic partnerships. And once you hear the truth, you'll never watch Gunsmoke the same way again. When Gunsmoke hit television screens in 1955, it was pitched as a gritty western. Tough men, lawless towns, and moral codes drawn in gun smoke and blood. It wasn't built on romance. It wasn't supposed to be. But almost instantly, something unexpected started pulling at the audience's attention. It wasn't the gunfights. It wasn't even the crime. It was the way Marshal Matt Dillon looked at Miss Kitty Russell, and the way she looked back. James Arness brought a quiet authority to his role as the Marshal. He was tall, commanding, and mostly unreadable. Amanda Blake, playing the savvy and strong-willed saloon owner, brought heat and heart to the dusty frontier. From their very first scene together, something was different. Viewers noticed it, even if the show never acknowledged it. There was an unspoken connection, something deep and electric, present in every stolen glance, every moment of silence that lasted just a few seconds too long. They weren't touching, they weren't flirting outright, but they were always right there. And that's what kept millions tuning in week after week. For 20 years, fans followed every word, every shift in tone, searching for clues. Were they in love? Were they hiding something? And if so, why? What made this even more powerful was how tightly the show held back. Unlike other series that played into the romance to boost ratings, Gunsmoke resisted it. Rumors swirled for years. Were they involved in real life? Was that chemistry scripted or genuine? Arness avoided personal questions whenever possible. He rarely did interviews, and when he did, he stuck to safe ground, talking about the work, the westerns, the role of Dillon. When pressed about Blake, he was polite but firm. Blake, on the other hand, was more media-savvy but just as careful. She played along with the mystery. In public, she spoke of Arness as a true professional. In private, she described him as unreachable. Still, she defended their bond, calling it one of the most important relationships of her life. Some believed Arness himself resisted the idea, fearing that if the romance became real, but there was also the possibility no one wanted to say out loud, that they were protecting something deeply personal, something too fragile to share with the world. What made all of this even more gripping was the timeline. For 20 years, Arness and Blake worked side by side, filming over 500 episodes, creating one of the longest-running and most beloved partnerships in TV history. That mystery would only deepen with what happened next, because as the series neared its end, something unexpected tore their connection apart. By the early 1970s, something had shifted behind the scenes of Gunsmoke. The ratings were still solid, fans were still loyal, but Amanda Blake was growing tired. She'd played Miss Kitty for almost 20. At first, Kitty was fresh, fiery, full of life, but as the seasons wore on, Blake began to feel like the character was stuck. Always the saloon owner, always standing behind the bar, always waiting for Matt Dillon to finally say something real, and he never did. The network shut it down fast. CBS had spent years crafting Gunsmoke as a clean-cut, no-nonsense western. Marshal Matt Dillon wasn't supposed to be vulnerable. He wasn't supposed to be in love. Executives worried that changing the tone, especially so late in the show's life, could backfire. They believed fans didn't want romance in Dodge. They wanted conflict, a new outlaw every week. They didn't want to see Matt soften, but that wasn't the only reason the episode was scrapped. Behind closed doors, there were whispers that Arness himself wasn't comfortable with it. Amanda Blake didn't take it well. She had invested everything into her role. Kitty wasn't just another side character. She was the heart of the show, but she wasn't allowed to grow. For nearly 2 decades, she stood in the background, smiling, supporting, always strong, but always waiting for her moment. When it finally came, it was taken away, and that was the moment everything changed. Amanda didn't explode. She didn't cause a scene, but her excitement was gone. She stopped staying late on set. Her energy dropped. And then, one day in 1974, she simply walked away. No warning, no grand announcement, just gone. The show went on without her. For someone who had shared the screen with Amanda for almost 600 episodes, his silence spoke louder than words ever could. Some insiders claimed there had been tension between the two actors by that point. Years of tight schedules, network control, and constant speculation had worn them down. Others said the bond was still there, but it had become too complicated. Whatever the truth was, one thing was clear. Amanda Blake had reached her limit. And when she left, she didn't look back. She didn't cash in on the show's legacy like so many others did. She disappeared from the spotlight almost completely. Occasionally, she'd show up at charity events or take small roles, but never anything like Gunsmoke. Meanwhile, Arness remained the face of the show. Week after week, he showed up as Matt Dillon, stoic as ever. But the dynamic had changed. Without Kitty, Dodge City felt colder. The show lost something subtle but powerful, the emotional thread that had held it all together. And even then, he said nothing. Not even a single word about the woman he'd acted beside for nearly 20 years. People wondered, was he bitter, or was he just doing what he always did, keeping his feelings locked away? But time has a way of pulling truths out of the shadows. And as the years passed, Arness would slowly begin to open up. At first, people thought maybe it was just the way he was. Arness had always kept his private life locked up. Even when he was one of the most recognizable faces on television, he avoided the limelight with precision. Arness seemed different after Amanda left. Less talkative, more withdrawn. Still, Arness said nothing. Even when Gunsmoke finally aired its last episode in 1975, he gave no public reaction to Amanda's absence. Throughout the 1980s, Gunsmoke gained new life in syndication. A new generation of fans discovered the slow burn connection between Marshal Matt Dillon and Miss Kitty. And just like their parents before them, they asked the same questions. Were they in love? Did something happen off-screen? Why didn't they ever talk about it? The curiosity only grew, but Arness remained silent. It wasn't until the mid-1990s that things began to change. Arness had stayed out of the public eye for years. In a later interview, he said Amanda was the soul of the show, that no one, not even the producers, understood how important she was to the world they'd built. He said she was brilliant, focused, and fiercely protective of her character. And then he said something that made the entire room go quiet. He said they understood each other better than most people ever do. The quiet sorrow in his tone was enough. He'd carried something with him all those years, something he never shared while she was alive. And that's what made the next part so haunting. Because just a few years after that interview, Amanda Blake was gone. Gone before Arness ever fully said what she meant to him. Gone before fans got any true closure. But James Arness wasn't finished yet, because after Amanda's passing, he finally broke the silence again. And what he said next, no one saw coming. Amanda Blake passed away in 1989. She was just 60 years old. The announcement made headlines, but not the kind you'd expect for someone who had helped define one of the longest-running shows in television history. Longtime Gunsmoke fans felt the weight immediately. They remembered Amanda not as just a supporting character, but as the steady heart of the show. She brought something fierce and warm to the screen. She was tough, but graceful. Without her, Dodge City never felt the same. For nearly 15 years, Arness had remained completely silent about Amanda's departure from Gunsmoke. And suddenly, everything they had seen between Matt and Kitty, the glances, the hesitation, the years of emotional tension, felt less like fiction and more like a mirror. Amanda's final years were spent away from Hollywood. She moved toward activism, especially in the area of animal rights. She gave up the spotlight almost completely, taking on charity work, staying behind the scenes, avoiding questions about the past. And while Amanda moved into a new phase of life, James Arness stayed in the shadows of the one they had shared. He never remarried. He never pursued another role that reached the same emotional depth. And as time passed, he became even more guarded. Amanda Blake's passing didn't just end a chapter in television history. It closed a door that had never fully opened. And for James Arness, it left a silence even louder than the one he'd held onto all those years. But just when the world thought the story was over, Arness did something no one expected. A final gesture. something small but powerful. And for the first time, he let the past speak louder than his silence ever could. By the late 2000s, James Arness was living a life far removed from the Hollywood spotlight. He no longer gave interviews, rarely made public appearances, and had turned down every offer to return to Dodge City for a reunion. He kept to himself, spending most of his time at home or surrounded by a small circle of family and close friends. But even in the silence, his connection to Gunsmoke never really faded, and neither did his connection to Amanda Blake. Years had passed since her death, but those who knew Arness said he never really moved on from it. Not emotionally, not mentally. He didn't talk about her often, but when he did, it was always in the present tense, as if she hadn't truly left, as if the character she created and the bond they shared was still somewhere just out of frame. That's why what happened next came as a complete surprise. In 2009, a group of producers was working on a special retrospective for classic American television. The project wasn't flashy. It wasn't designed for ratings or network hype. It was a quiet, respectful tribute to shows that had shaped generations. Gunsmoke was one of them, and naturally, the producers reached out to Arness. They didn't expect a response. He had declined similar requests for years, but this time, something changed. Not only did Arness reply, he asked if Amanda Blake would be included. The team assured him that she would. They planned to dedicate a portion of the program to her work on the show, her character, and the lasting legacy she left behind. There was a pause on the other end of the call. Then Arness said he wanted to contribute something. Not an interview, not an appearance, just a letter. They didn't push him for details. They didn't even know if he'd follow through. But a few weeks later, a single-page envelope arrived. It was handwritten, neat, careful. No formal header, no dramatic signature. Just a letter, and what was inside would change everything people thought they knew. In the letter, Arness didn't speak like a TV star or a former cowboy hero. He spoke like a man looking back at something unfinished. He started by talking about Amanda's very first day on set. How she arrived early, how she didn't wait for anyone to tell her what to do, how she adjusted her own costume, rewrote her lines, and fought for her character to have real strength. He said he respected her from the very first scene. He mentioned how Amanda challenged the writers, pushed back on scripts that painted Kitty too soft or too dependent, and refused to play into stereotypes. He wrote about how the show would never have lasted without her, that she gave Dodge City more than just color. She gave it warmth. She gave it heart. Then, Arness shared something no one expected. He admitted that there were days on set where everything felt like too much. The pressure, the repetition, the long hours, the isolation of being the lead. And that during those times, Amanda made it bearable. She brought levity, calm, and quiet strength. She grounded him, even when he didn't realize he needed grounding. He didn't talk about romantic feelings. He didn't confess to a secret relationship. But what he wrote next hit harder than either of those things. He ended the letter with one sentence. She always waited for him to say it. I hope she knew anyway. That line echoed with decades of unresolved tension. It said everything without spelling anything out. For fans who had spent years analyzing every glance between Matt and Kitty, every missed opportunity, every silent moment that screamed louder than words, it was confirmation. Not that they were in love in the way tabloids love to fantasize, but that something was there, something real, something neither of them ever truly spoke aloud. The producers were stunned. They had never seen this side of Arness. They debated whether to share the letter publicly, but ultimately honored his request to keep it within the tribute. Only a small group saw it at first, but over time, word of its contents leaked out, and when it did, the internet lit up. Message boards, fan forums, Facebook groups dedicated to classic television. All of them started dissecting that final line. What did he mean by it? Was it guilt? Was it closure? Was it the only way he could say what he'd never said face to face? The answers didn't matter as much as the truth behind them. James Arness had carried that line with him for years. Maybe since Amanda left the show. Maybe since she passed. Maybe since the very first time he looked across that saloon and realized he wasn't just acting. It wasn't about Matt and Kitty anymore. It was about James and Amanda, about everything that had been built on screen and left unsaid off it. In the end, Arness never spoke about Amanda Blake again. That letter was the final word, a memory sealed in ink. a quiet confession tucked into history. But in those few sentences, he gave the world something more valuable than a love story or a dramatic reveal. He gave them honesty, the kind of truth that doesn't need a headline to matter. And just like that, after decades of silence, the Marshal finally spoke, and the message couldn't have been clearer. As the years wore on and Hollywood's golden age faded into the rearview mirror, James Arness quietly removed himself from the spotlight. He didn't announce a retirement. He didn't make a fuss. He simply stopped showing up. No award shows, no interviews, no talk show appearances. While others from his era leaned into nostalgia, eager to reflect on their careers, Arness chose silence. And for him, it wasn't about mystery or pride. It was about peace. But that peace came at a cost. The weight of 20 years on Gunsmoke didn't leave him. The role of Matt Dillon shaped his identity, publicly and privately. And woven into that role, into every episode, every shoot, every unsaid word, was Amanda Blake. Whether he admitted it or not, her absence echoed louder than most realized. It was a shadow that followed him long after the cameras stopped rolling. In the last decade of his life, Arness kept a small, quiet routine. He lived mostly at home, surrounded by books, photos, and mementos from a career he no longer spoke of. Friends who visited said the house was modest, comfortable. But one thing stood out in every room: memories of Gunsmoke. Photos from the early seasons, framed magazine covers, letters from fans. And always, somewhere near, was a picture of Amanda. It was never flashy and prominently displayed. One visitor recalled seeing a photograph of the two, taken off camera. They were laughing. Amanda had one hand on his shoulder, and he was looking at her, not with the stoic gaze of Matt Dillon, but with something softer, warmer. The photo was old, the edges worn, the frame simple, but it wasn't tucked away in an album or gathering dust in a drawer. It was near his reading chair, within arm's reach. That quiet placement said more than words ever could. Over time, Arness began to reflect more, but only in private. He didn't want to give interviews or write memoirs. He turned down multiple offers from publishers, hoping he'd tell the full story of his career. He refused television retrospectives, even when offered complete creative control. His reason was always the same. The work spoke for itself. He didn't want to rewrite it. Didn't want to repackage it, but those closest to him saw a different reason, one he didn't say out loud. It wasn't just about protecting the show, it was about protecting her. Amanda had passed quietly, without closure, without reunion, and Arness had never filled in the gaps she left behind. He never explained their relationship, never clarified the rumors, never gave the world the kind of sentimental closure so many fans had hoped for. Because that story, whatever it truly was, belonged to them. And even in his old age, he seemed unwilling to let anyone else touch it. His family described him as loyal to a fault. He remembered birthdays from 50 years ago, recalled names of guest stars others had forgotten, and though he rarely spoke about feelings, he had a memory like a vault, locked tight, but never empty. When it came to Amanda, that vault had its own corner, untouched, preserved, sacred. In 2010, just a year before his death, he declined a final offer to appear in a Gunsmoke reunion event. It would have brought back surviving cast members, honored the show's legacy, and paid tribute to Amanda. Arness said no, but before the producers hung up, he made a request. He asked if they would include her name first in the tribute reel. It wasn't a demand. It wasn't a condition. He didn't explain why. He just said it once, quietly, then changed the subject. And just like that, Amanda Blake, who had walked away from the show with no goodbye, no farewell episode, and no closing scene, was finally given the first word in the final tribute. Those who worked on the project said they could see it clearly. This wasn't just about honoring a former co-star. This was about making something right, something that had been left unsaid for too long. When Arness passed away in 2011, the world mourned the loss of a television legend. Obituaries remembered him as a towering figure in the Western genre, a symbol of American resilience, and a rare star who never chased fame. But what most didn't see was the man behind the image, a man who had spent decades carrying a silence that was more personal than professional. He left behind no tell-all interviews, no memoirs, no last-minute revelations, but he left traces. A picture on a shelf, a handwritten letter, a final request to put someone else's name first. For some, that wasn't enough. They still wanted details, answers, proof of what they believed had always been true. But for those who really understood the man James Arness had become, it was enough. Because love doesn't always come with declarations. Sometimes it lives in the things we choose not to say, and in the ones we never stop remembering. And in the quiet years of his life, Arness remembered her, always. Even long after the final episode aired, and both Amanda Blake and James Arness were gone, Gunsmoke refused to let go of its last secret. Not a scandal, not a tell-all, a scene, a single scene that, if it ever existed, could have rewritten television history. For decades, fans of the show believed something was missing. They didn't need flashbacks or spin-offs to sense it. They saw it in every conversation between Matt and Kitty, every moment where words were replaced by long, loaded silences. For 20 seasons, their relationship hovered between friendship and something far deeper, something unspoken. But there was always one question people kept asking: why didn't they ever kiss? It seems impossible. Nearly 600 episodes, a bond that endured longer than most real-life marriages, and not one kiss, not even a brush of the hand. It defied logic, and yet there it was. Two people tethered by a love that never reached the surface. Then the rumors started, not in magazines or fan letters, but from within the industry. Editors, cameramen, writers, all began telling versions of the same story, that a script had once been written, an episode late in the series' run, where Matt Dillon and Miss Kitty were finally going to acknowledge what everyone already knew. The scene was reportedly brief. In it, Matt walks into the Long Branch saloon after being away. He sees Kitty behind the bar. She looks up, not surprised, not nervous, just calm. They share a moment, a long pause, and then, for the first and only time in the show's history, he walks up, places a hand on her shoulder, and kisses her. It wasn't meant to be dramatic. It wasn't about shock value. It was about closure. But the scene never aired, and that's where the mystery begins. Some say the network pulled it before it was even shot. That CBS executives thought it would change the tone of the show too drastically. Gunsmoke was built on grit and restraint, not romance. Others say it was filmed, but never edited into the final cut. Arness himself objected after seeing a rough version, worried it would redefine how people remembered his character. Then there's the third theory, the one that refuses to die, that the scene was filmed quietly on a closed set, with only a handful of people present. The footage, according to these claims, was stored separately, marked for internal review or possible use in a finale that never happened. The reel was allegedly labeled something vague, something innocuous, and then it was shelved, forgotten, or deliberately buried. Over the years, bits and pieces have surfaced. A script supervisor once said she saw a version of the final script with a handwritten note, "Kiss scene pulled." A retired editor claimed there was a tape that disappeared from the vault in the late 1970s. No one can prove any of it, and yet the belief won't fade, because it feels too right, too fitting. After all those years of tension, of unsaid feelings, of missed opportunities, a single quiet kiss would have tied it all together, with the kind of stillness that had always defined them. Even Amanda Blake hinted at it. In one of her final interviews, when asked why Kitty and Matt never kissed, she smiled and said, "Some things are better left unsaid, or maybe unseen." It was cryptic, carefully worded, but it raised questions. Had something been filmed? Had something been lost? James Arness, as usual, said nothing, but that silence made people believe even more, because if the scene had never existed, wouldn't it be easier to just say so? But he never did. He dodged, deflected, moved on, which, to longtime fans, sounded a lot like a man protecting something, not hiding it, holding it close. And maybe that's all it ever was. A myth, a moment created by a fan base desperate for resolution. Maybe the kiss never happened. Not on screen, not behind the scenes, not at all. But maybe it did. Maybe it lives in a dusty canister, in a storage vault in California, mislabeled or misplaced, never to be seen again. Maybe it was thrown out. Maybe it was saved by someone who knew it mattered. Or maybe it exists only in the minds of millions who watched week after week, waiting for something they were never given, but always felt. Because sometimes, belief itself becomes its own kind of truth. And when a story runs for 20 years without ever closing the door, it leaves just enough space for people to imagine the ending they needed. A kiss, a glance, a final moment that said what they never could. And if it does exist, if that scene is out there, waiting, then maybe the greatest love story in Western television didn't end with silence after all. Maybe it just never got the chance to speak. Time has a way of fading even the brightest stars. Shows get canceled, memories blur, and the faces that once filled millions of living rooms quietly vanish from the culture that once adored them. But every so often, something holds on. Something resists being forgotten. And in the case of Gunsmoke, it wasn't just the gunfights or the grit that gave it life long after it ended. It was the silence. That silence belonged to two people, James Arness and Amanda Blake. Together, they portrayed Matt Dillon and Miss Kitty for nearly 20 years. They stood side by side through changing writers, shifting tones, and evolving audiences. But what never changed, what never bent under pressure, was the line they never crossed. They didn't kiss. They didn't say, "I love you." They didn't get the sunset ending that other shows handed out like candy. They gave their audience something far more difficult: restraint. And somehow, that restraint made the story unforgettable. People waited. For 20 years, they waited. Every episode, every glance, every shared scene sparked the same question. Would this be the moment? Would Matt finally say what he felt? Would Kitty finally hear it? And every time, the show stopped, just short, just enough to keep the mystery alive. In a television landscape full of fast answers and big declarations, Matt and Kitty gave us something different. They made people believe in the power of what wasn't said. They made people feel that a glance could be as heavy as a speech, and that a silence could hold more meaning than any kiss ever could. But the power of their connection didn't end with the final episode. If anything, it became more powerful because it remained unfinished, and when Amanda Blake passed away, followed years later by James Arness, that silence, once just part of a storyline, became real. And yet, something strange happened. The story didn't fade. It would have made sense for the legacy of Matt and Kitty to become just another footnote in classic TV history. But it didn't. Instead, their story kept resurfacing. New fans discovered old episodes and found themselves drawn into the same tension. They asked the same questions. They saw the same chemistry. And they couldn't stop thinking about what had been left unsaid. That's when the speculation deepened. The rumor of the lost scene, the handwritten letter Arness sent years later, the quiet tributes, the way his voice softened whenever Amanda's name was mentioned in rare interviews. None of these things were meant to fuel a legend, but they did, because people sensed there was more to the story, not just between Matt and Kitty, but between James and Amanda. Maybe it wasn't a secret romance. Maybe it wasn't some grand unspoken love affair, but it was something. You don't share 2 decades of screen time with someone and come away untouched. You don't look at someone the way Arness looked at Blake, over and over again, without feeling something beneath it. And the fact that they never spoke openly about it only added to the weight. Because in that silence, viewers saw their own stories, their own near misses, their own could-have-beens. Matt and Kitty weren't larger than life. They were human, flawed, careful, just like the people who watched them. Even now, long after both actors are gone, the question still lingers. Why didn't they ever say it? Why didn't Matt tell Kitty what he felt? Why didn't Arness tell the world what she meant to him? Maybe because the truth didn't belong to the world. Maybe it was theirs. Something they carried privately through late-night shoots, long hours on dusty sets, and quiet rides home after wrap. Maybe what made their connection so real was the fact that it never became a storyline. It stayed untouched, protected, and maybe, in protecting it, they made it eternal. Arness once said he was proud of the way Gunsmoke held back. Proud that the show never gave into easy payoffs or forced resolutions. It was a Western, yes, but it was also about people trying to survive, to live with honor, to feel things without always saying them. And that's exactly what Matt and Kitty did, every week, for 20 years. But what neither of them likely knew was how deeply that quiet would echo after they were gone. Because the legacy they left behind isn't just about an old TV show. It's about longing. It's about restraint. It's about love that never needed to shout. And maybe that's why we're still talking about them today. Because while other love stories ended with a kiss, theirs ended with a pause. And in that pause lived everything that ever needed to be said. It wasn't loud, it wasn't clear, but it was honest. And sometimes, that's enough to last forever. Years have passed, generations have changed, The television world has evolved 1,000 times over. Shows now burn bright and fade fast. Streaming platforms push out new romances, love triangles, and shocking finales almost daily. But somehow, the quiet story between Marshal Matt Dillon and Miss Kitty Russell still lingers. Not because of what they said, but because of what they didn't. What started as a Western became something else entirely. A lesson in patience. A study in longing. A love story with no climax. Only questions, only glances, only moments that stop just before the edge. And while many shows handed out easy answers, Gunsmoke made its audience sit with the unknown. That's why the silence still echoes. Why fans, old and new, still dissect scenes from episodes filmed over half a century ago. They see it in the way Kitty looks at Matt when he walks through the saloon door, in the way Matt stands just a little too close, says her name just a little too softly. There's nothing in the script, but there's everything in the silence. And for James Arness and Amanda Blake, that silence was the legacy. They never gave us the scene we all waited for. They never gave interviews explaining it away. They never offered closure, not for the characters, not for themselves. But in that decision, intentional or not, they left something more valuable than clarity. They left space. Space for interpretation, space for connection, space for every viewer to see their own story in the one that was never fully told. There was no wedding, no kiss, no dramatic goodbye, but there was presence. Consistency, a slow-burning, deeply felt partnership that said more with a pause than most romances say in a monologue. And maybe that's what makes it timeless. Because some endings don't need to be written. Some stories aren't meant to be finished. Some people enter our lives, not to stay, not to fulfill some final promise, but to remind us what love looks like when it's real. Matt and Kitty never told each other what they felt, but maybe they didn't need to. And maybe James and Amanda didn't either. Because sometimes, the loudest truths live in silence. And sometimes, the greatest love stories are the ones that never say a word. What do you think? Do you believe James Arness and Amanda Blake shared something deeper behind the scenes? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and click this next video on screen for another interesting story.